Welcome back once again. In this session we're going to return to our major key 1-4-5 chord progression and examine this chord progression in seventh chords. That's to say chords of 4 notes as opposed to the 3-note triad chords we've been using so far. To begin with the 1 chord, we return first of all to our major scale, where our 1 major triad was formed by taking notes 1, 3 and 5 of the major scale. So we now simply extend this process one step further and take the next but 1 note of the scale, that's note 7. So now we have in scale notes, notes 1, 3, 5 and 7. In terms of stacking up intervals of a third, we have a major third, a minor third, and now another major third. And in terms of intervals from the root of the chord, we have a major third, a perfect fifth, and now a major seventh. That's major third, perfect fifth, major seventh. And the chord formed from these notes is a major seventh chord. So in the key of C major, where our 1 chord is C, we have a C major seventh, and this can be played quite easily by taking our normal C major triad open position voicing and simply lifting the first finger, allowing the open B string to sound as the 7th of the chord. As with the triad version of this chord, we can introduce the 6th string, play it open to put an E in the bass and create a first inversion C major 7th chord, or we can play the G on the 6th string to play a second inversion of the C major 7th. Moving on to the 4th, remember our basic triad chord consisted of notes 4, 6 and 8. Extend this pattern now to include note 10, remembering that note 8 is the octave, therefore note 10 is an octave above the 3rd. So we now have notes 4, 6, 8, 10. In thirds, that's a major third, followed by a minor third, followed once again by another major third. So the intervals from the root of the chord are major third, perfect fifth, major 7th, once again. Major third, perfect fifth, major 7th, creating once again a major 7th chord. In the key of C, our 4 chord is F, so this gives us an F major 7th, which we can play in this position on the top 4 strings. We can also include the 5th string, play an open A here, and we get a first inversion of the F major 7th. If we play a C on string 5, we get the second inversion of the F major 7th. And here we can go one step further if we want to, play the open 6th string. This puts an E in the bass, that's the 7th of the chord. So we now have an inversion with the 7th in the bass, and that makes a 3rd inversion of the F major 7. Moving on to the 5 chord, our 5 major triad consisted of notes 5, 7 and 9. So we go up the scale once again. One more alternate note gives us note 11, that's to say an octave above the 4th of the scale. So in notes 5, 7, 9, 11, thirds. That gives us a major third, a minor third, and this time another minor third. So in intervals from the root of the chord we now have a major third, a perfect fifth, and a minor seventh. That's major third, perfect fifth, minor seventh, forming this chord here. In the key of C, that's a G chord, so we can play it in the more familiar open position here. But what are we going to call this chord? After all, we now have a chord with a major third and a minor seventh in it. So it's obviously not any sort of minor chord. Equally obviously, it's not a major seventh chord. Well, in fact, this chord is called a dominant seventh chord. Why dominant seventh? Well, you remember back in our first session I mentioned that in classical vocabulary each of the degrees of the scale has a name. So far we've only referred to the tonic and the octave. However, each of the other notes also has a name, and the fifth is called the dominant. Therefore any chord that's built on the fifth note of the scale is a dominant chord. So the seventh chord built on this note is the dominant seventh chord. However, these chords are often referred to far more simply as just seventh chords, or even seven chords. If you ever come across a chord described as a seven chord, in this case in the key of C major it would be a G7 chord, without the qualifying terms major or minor, you can assume that what's intended is a dominant seventh chord, that is to say a chord with a major third and a minor seventh. So now we have the complete chord progression in seventh chords. That's the 1 major seventh, the 4 major seventh, and the 5 dominant seventh, or simply 5-7 chord. So in the key of C major, that gives us a C major 7, F major 7, and G7. Of course, there's no reason that the chord progression has to be played in all seventh chords, or indeed in all triad chords. The triad and seventh chord forms can be freely mixed and matched, and indeed one particularly popular technique is to use a sequence predominantly in triad chords, but to introduce the dominant seventh chord before returning to the one chord to create the perfect cadence. And one reason this works so well is that the semitone movement, which we've discussed from the third of the 5 chord to the root of the 1 chord, is reflected by a downward semitone movement from the 7th of the 5 chord to the 3rd of the 1 chord. So we get that movement going up and that movement going down, creating this kind of effect within the chord, and you can listen for it in the progression played in full chords. So there's the first of our sets of 7 chords. We now have the major 7th and the dominant 7th chords. In our next video we're going to move on to the 2-5-1 chord progression, which will introduce the third type of 7th chord, the minor 7th chord. So until then, keep well and goodbye.